And I was going to say, when people ask what you're doing, what you're working on, how do you respond? How do you explain Hellblade to people?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of aspects to it. One is it's an action-adventure game, fantasy action-adventure game, in a similar vein to the ones we've done before, like Heavenly Sword or Enslaved or DMT. But there are two standout parts of this game. One is that we're self-funding this game, so it's the first game that we're funding ourselves. It's a small team of 15 people currently. It'll probably stay at 15.
I think you called it an indie AAA.
Yeah, independent AAA, for want of a better word, is what we call it. So it's the idea is to create a game that has the production values of AAA games, that looks and sounds great, but that has more of the sensibilities and ethos of indie development, or independent film development, which is to find a different angle or a different aspect to it. And in our case, the fantasy in Hellblade is different from the usual Tolkien-esque or I don't know, a space marine type thing. But nothing wrong with those themes, but they've been wanted to try and find a new angle for fantasy. And in this case, it's about Senua, and she suffers from mental health conditions, which means that she sees the world very differently from everyone else around her. And so, as a player, you explore the world that she lives in through her eyes, and that's where the fantasy element, if you like, comes in.
Okay, and if you tell me a little bit about how the character came about and how the idea for the game came about and then developed as you sort of pinned more and more details down.
Yeah, I mean, we're known for doing melee type games, sword-based games, and it helps to set it in a historical setting. And I thought Celtic, being from England, like Celtic culture hasn't been represented very much in games. And I looked into the history of that, and then I came across an article about a goddess called Senua. It was Senua. They thought her name was Senua, but it turned out to be Senuna. But anyway, I like Senua better. And her tomb was found with an inscription that said something like, to Senua, goddess Senua, we willingly fulfilled our vow. And so there's a mystery there. We will never know who she is. And I thought, it sounds like we could create a work of fiction around that. So that was appealing. And then I did want to make something that was fantasy-based. I like fantasy. But I sort of wanted to find something more grounded than the usual fantasy that you see. And separately to that, I was reading up about the mind, creativity. On Reddit in particular, I read up a lot of first-hand experiences of psychosis and schizophrenia. And even just reading about it, I started to feel frightened of what people were seeing and how vivid it seemed to be. So I thought it was a subject to explore, because I don't recall seeing it portrayed very often in video games, at least not in a overt manner. Often you see it in horror-themed games, but I thought I like to try and delve into a subject and understand it, and that's what I did. And the more I read, the more I was compelled to make her.
Okay. When you've been sort of developing the game, you've been working with Paul Fletcher, haven't you, from the University of Cambridge?
Yeah.
He's an expert in psychosis and related illnesses. And so I was wondering at what point he became involved in the process, how you met him, how I think it was Wellcome that put you in touch with him, or at least facilitated.
Well, actually, I mean, we were put in. Tackling something like mental health is obviously going to be a sensitive issue, and it's a taboo subject. Really, it's still a subject that affects probably all of us, I would say, either indirectly or directly. And I knew we needed to really do our research, so we got in touch with Paul Fletcher from Cambridge, because we're based in Cambridge, and he does a lot of work with Wellcome, and he's helped us enormously. And through him, we've become more and more involved with Wellcome. So Wellcome gave us a development grant to start with, a small grant, so that we could continue working with Paul. And then we produced a section of the game, a vertical slice, and then we showed that to Wellcome. And they gave us a co-production award, which has opened up a lot more doors for us.
And in the work that you've done with Paul Fletcher, sort of how did that develop over time? What did you sort of present at first, and then how did that get refined?
Yeah, so I mean, it was very early on, and we talked to Paul about the premise of the game. And Paul's he's a professor of health neuroscience and a psychiatrist, so he has a lot of experience working with people that have lived experience. And so it started at the story stage, really, like trying to create a character profile for Senua, how she might have grown up, how typical symptoms would have developed, and how it might have affected her. Often it's the stigma attached to the symptoms that make people suffer more than the condition itself. So it just became a collaborative story experience, actually. And then we created a vertical slice, and a lot of the ideas that Paul had taught us. So he came and talked to the team and told everyone on the team, the artist, everyone, about how the mind works, the latest theory of the mind, and how conditions can manifest themselves. And so we incorporated that into a vertical slice, a playthrough. And I mean, I brought a video as well that we could show, which it's the opening cutscene of the game, and it incorporates a lot of what we knew back then when we made it a few months ago.
Okay.
So I'd like to show that first, if you please. If we could roll video number 1, please.
Peggy 18.
I'm not turning back. It took months to get here. Well, maybe, but I made my promise.
You will die here.
We'll all die someday.
It's getting dark.
I'll continue tomorrow.
You're afraid of the dark.
I'm being patient.
Getting closer to him.
I hope so.
You sure it's safe here?
Yes. Nobody followed us.
Be careful.
I know. I just wish I could rest a little. Shh. Someone's here. I see you. No!
They know you're weak. Get up and fight. You're pathetic.
Control the fear. Let it pass through.
Find the light, the light
Remember
is just right
his
behind it grow.
eyes.
Find the light, the light is just straight behind it grow.
Open your eyes.
So in that video, there are a few aspects to the symptoms that we've added. Obviously, there's the voices. In particular, a lot of people describe the concept of a berater voice, someone that's ever critical. people also talk about more kind voices, like almost like a often like a sympathetic or a more spiritual voice, and this can vary very massively from person to person. But in treating the game, if you notice, like the camera is continuous, so it gives you a kind of a feeling of like you're a third party observing, a feeling of disassociation, and that's done on purpose so that you feel almost like you're part of Senua's mind observing her. And everything that happens with the sound and the visuals and hallucinations, the things she sees, it's all subjective. So there's no concept of this is what's really happening. Everything that's happening is happening through her eyes and senses. And there's no aha moment at the end or at any point that says, oh wait, that's not real, this is real. In truth, everything for Senua is real. And it's that level of confusion that we wanted to portray, where everything's noisy and uncertain, and yet she has to still cope with what's going on around her. You still have to play the game and figure out the rules of the world and navigate your way through it as best you can. And I think that's why we've been quite overt about what the game is, like the theme of the game is, because some people might say, well, isn't that a spoiler that she's imagining things, for example? But it's not, I don't think, because if that's your reality and you can't break free from it, it doesn't matter whether somebody tells you it's real or it's not real. You still have to deal with it.
And so you were saying about the dissociative element of the third-person camera, and I was wondering whether that was, because obviously some of the characterization is done through the voices that Senua's hearing and interacting with, but there's also now this other person, you, sort of controlling her and sort of being in charge of her movements. Is that something that you factored into, I guess, the fiction, or is that more something that you trusted people would take as a game interface experience?
I think it's sort of, I think it's implied, like it's never clear. Like when the camera's moving around her, often people, when they hear voices, it comes from a place. So they might hear it inside the head, but they could equally hear it in a position in space. So in this case, as the camera moves around, it's moving through different characters. So on her right side, you hear the berator's voice, and as it moves through the other side, you hear the other voice. And then it takes on a third form, which represents her fear, the thing that she's battling against. So I think it's not as clear as the camera is the player. There's a continuous confusion about whether it's more of a feeling that she's being watched, and sometimes she will talk to the camera. She will turn and talk to the camera, but at that point in time, the observer is a different character. So it kind of changes and shifts, and you might wonder what role the player has in it, but it's not specifically called out.
And you've mentioned specifically about hearing voices and incorporating that part of her experience in the game. But I was wondering, you mentioned the vertical slice that you've been showing to people. I was wondering what else people would find in there that touches on mental illness, or that touches on sort of how the external world appears to her, and how you've sort of tried to build that in.
Yeah, so we like there's no HUD in the game. There's no energy bars or inventories or anything like that. Everything happens within the world space. So a lot of the concepts that you would have in games, such as keys and doors, are interpreted in a different way. Often there's people can see what they want to see in a sense, or they can become extra attuned to certain elements in the environment. This isn't, by the way, just people with mental health issues. This is everyone. You know, the ability to read the weather or tell the weather from the clouds or the stars. I mean, our minds are built to see patterns and be attuned to our environment, and some people are more sensitive to our environment than others. And so part of that kind of part of how you unlock new areas or find new meaning in areas is to become attuned to them in some way, acquire the skills to become attuned to a certain element, and then to see it in part of the environment. It's quite hard and ambiguous to explain, but it's. I think when doing our research with Paul and the service users as well with direct lived experience, what really struck me more than anything else was, I was probably quite ignorant to a lot of this subject area before I started this game. I wasn't even sure whether people saw and heard things literally in front of them, and it turns out they do. A lot of people do, and I wondered what kind of why this can happen in our minds. Like, what is it? What is it about those people that they can see that? And then I realized that it wasn't those people. It's all of us. We walk around thinking that everything around us is real, that there is an objective reality, and there isn't. And it's quite easy to demonstrate this scientifically. Our eyes are only able to see about 1 or 2% of the world in front of us. So what about the rest? Where does that come from? Because we've got the sense that we're in the reading room, but all I'm seeing right now is your eyes. And so where does the rest come from? And it turns out we don't see literally. We don't see in pictures. We see colors, shapes, depth, orientation. We see movement. We see light. We see all kinds of abstract information that then gets assembled into a simulation of our world. So if we take that a step further and we accept that every one of us has a unique sense of reality, there is no objective sense of reality, then it starts to become easier to understand that in some people they can be more sensitive to certain things, and that seeing, hearing a voice, like we all have an inner voice in our head that tells us things, but if that sensitivity is increased and you can hear that voice literally, it sort of makes sense. We have to be able to simulate the world around us in order to exist and function as human beings. And a lot of the conditions we associate with mental health illness are in fact natural extensions of our minds themselves. So it's that to me made me understand it more than anything else, and made me empathize really with people. It's really hard to listen to someone when they say that they hear a voice 24 hours a day screaming at them, and it's unrelenting. And you think, what would you do in that position? At some point, you wouldn't be able to resist. The stress would be just too overwhelming, and you would try and answer back, and you would try and get out of it. And a lot of people are just dealing with that in the same way that you and I might do. So if there's a way to portray some of those things in the game, that's kind of what we want to do.
And when you were saying earlier that you've spoken to a lot of these service users and sort of you've shown them your game as well, or where you're at the moment, I was wondering what the most interesting bits of feedback that you've got have been, or perhaps the most eye-opening or unexpected.
Yeah, so we met up with with 5 service users at Recovery College East in Fulbourn, in Cambridge, and we showed them the vertical slice and played through the game. And I really was not sure what their feedback would be. I mean, they were very enthusiastic. Like, they were very happy that in some ways someone was just there to talk to them and listen to them, and not necessarily a doctor or someone to judge them. It's someone that wants to find out more about, me and Paul, like, we wanted to find out more about what they see and feel, to get that more human perspective. And one thing that I learned that I didn't expect was that it can be very beautiful sometimes. That sometimes what people see can be incredibly exhilarating and pretty. Sometimes it can be very, very negative. But after we met up with them, what we did was we took lots of notes, and then we started to rapidly try and prototype some of these ideas in Unreal Engine, which is what the engine we're using. And so we went back to the office and did that, and then invited the service users back into our office and showed them what we did, what we created, and discussed where things seem to fit and where seems don't. Now it's every single person's experience is unique, but there are common threads and there are things that can feel truthful, and so that's what we were trying to do. And in fact, I brought another video. That's the only other video I brought, but I brought another video which is a compilation of these rapid prototyping tests in Unreal Engine. A lot of it's based on the service users, and some of it's based on Professor Paul Fletcher's experience as a psychiatrist. And there's a music track I put on it as well, which is from musician Andy LaPlega, who's working on the game. But if we could queue up and run video 2, please.
Hands will know my heart is so, love is so far away. Don't you know how I wanna feel deeper? I could never know how you grow, all these days are killing me. Now I see deep in me insanity does unfold. I just wanna feel deeper, deeper. I just wanna feel deeper, deeper. As we all know, my heart is so, love is so far away. Don't you know how I wanna feel deeper? I could never know how you grow, all these days are killing me. Feel like this, read like this, I just wanna live, that's all. I just wanna feel deeper, deeper. I just wanna feel deeper, deeper.
Peggy 18.
So a lot of those. So the idea now is we've invited the group back to further sessions. So what we'll do is as we start producing these videos, we'll continue to kind of talk about them, and then as we start developing gameplay sections and scenes in the game, we'll iterate with them as collaborators and try and represent it, I guess you could say, more truthfully.
Okay, and the other thing that I was wondering was, obviously in that video, it felt like they were sketches, obviously sort of rapid prototypes of ideas or of things that people had mentioned. But I was wondering whether you were far enough along in development that you'd found anything that you'd wanted to incorporate and couldn't, or that was proving to be a real sort of sticking point in terms of getting it right.
Not yet. I mean, we've been prototyping, designing and prototyping various aspects of the game for a year. That video we just saw was the result of about a week and a half's work. We've got another year of development, and we want to get as far as possible with the representations. And some of it, the advantage of doing it within a game is that I think even unlike films and books, you get you get a direct experience. You get to perform actions. If you make if you create a world and a character that's compelling, you can embody a character in a way that film and books can't. With things like the PlayStation Rumble and movement controller, there's probably other aspects, even the speaker in the pad. There's probably other things that we can do to try and give a sense of what it could be like. We'll never replicate it exactly, and we don't think we ever will. But I think that just having an inkling of what it might be like is something that makes this game interesting, but also more compelling, I think.
I think I'm going to ask people if they have questions in a sec, but I just wanted to ask one last one of my own. Obviously, if people sort of a bit reticent, then I can just carry on talking. But I was wondering, you mentioned before we even started about a piece of research that Paul Fletcher had found and shared with you about Celtic treatment of mental illness, and I was wondering sort of maybe a little bit more about that just for these guys, 'cause it sounded really interesting, but also if you'd had any other sort of particular points of influence, like maybe TV or film or books that you'd come across that were striking for one reason or another.
Yeah, in terms of books, I think one book that Paul Fletcher gave us was if you're interested in the neuroscience, it's called The Predictive Mind, and it's
Write that down.
Yeah, The Predictive Mind by Howry, and it's quite it's a little hard to read, like quite difficult academic, but for me it was revelatory. What it talks about is that what our mind is a computational device, a computational machine that is constantly trying to predict the future so that we can take action in it. So the idea of simulating a world and then predicting what's going to happen so that you can take action. I got a lot from that book. Another book that's more personal in nature is called Henry's Demons. Do you remember what the author was for that? Patrick Coburn. And Henry Coburn. All right. So this was written by a journalist whose son developed schizophrenia. And the book is quite unique. It's written by the father, just like from a father's perspective. And it's also written by the son. And he writes his entries while suffering from schizophrenia. So that gives you two perspectives that are very human in nature. And then if you're interested in a more if you're a programmer or like interested in the kind of that side of things, How to Create a Mind by Ray Kurzweil. It's Ray Kurzweil is again a fascinating book. In terms of movies, A Beautiful Mind does actually quite a great job of it, I'd say. There's another movie called Clean Shaven, which is really hard to watch, but I've read that people or at least I've read some people that have said that it's the closest thing to their direct experience, and that's why it is a really hard movie to watch. Very unique movie.
Okay.
And I forgot what your first question was.
Well, it was more about the that piece of research that
Oh,
Paul found
yes.
for you
So-
guys, but
So the game is fantasy. So, well, it's historical fantasy. So it's loosely based on the Viking arrival in Orkney. So they arrived when the Orkney Picts were there, and the Celtic Picts, and soon after the population was wiped out. So when you put a condition that we're talking about in an ancient setting where there is no help, if you like, in terms of medicine and doctors, or at least not help as we know it, you'd think that the understanding of the condition would be very primitive, but in fact they seem to have a very like an extraordinary understanding of various mental conditions, and they had specific words for different classes of mental illness, if you like Gaelta, which is a person that suffers from mental illness that then goes off onto quests, which is a common recurrence in schizophrenia, for example. Druth, the word Druth, which means the fool, and they had various other categories and classifications. And in a world where you believe in hundreds of gods, if not thousands, and you're steeped in myth, and you're hearing voices and all manner of hallucinations and visions, you can start to see how it's shaped their world and their understanding of the world. So it's not always necessarily considered madness in the way that we understand it.
Okay. In that case, did any of you guys have any questions that you wanted to direct? Cool. I think Kerry has a microphone that she will point at you.
Okay. Hi. I have a question. You said the user or the player is a third-party observer. So how would that feed into gameplay? Because as a third-party observer, I would just observe and not necessarily interact.
I think right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't take that term or that phrase too literally. I think when you play any game that's engaging, you sort of disassociate from yourself and you become that character. You know, it's and in films as well and books. Like your perspective shifts to that character, and you become them. But I felt like so you play it like a normal game. It's still a third-person action game or a story-driven game. I should say it's more story-driven than action, that you control and move around and navigate the world. But at the same time, I think keeping the camera feel like an observer, give you that sense, that uneasy sense that someone's watching, and it could be you, or it could be you embodying someone else, or it's possibly. I don't wish I could explain it more succinctly, because it's kind of supposed to be a little bit uneasy and confusing.
Did you have a question? Oh, sorry. You moved in a kind of suggestive fashion. There's one there, though.
Hi. So what do you try to achieve from this game? Like, once it's released, once it's played and it's out there, are you trying to get people to empathize with mental illness, or are you trying to get a fantasy-based representation of what these people are going through?
The main thing we want to do is to make a compelling game. Like we're not actually on a mission to educate the world, although it might seem that way because that's a lot of what we're talking about. But I believe that good films and good books and good games should do their research when they're going to tackle a subject. So, like 2001, for example, before they went to the moon, the research and the portrayal of space was spot on. And even if no one had been to the moon, been to space at that, been to the moon at that point, it still felt truthful. Ex Machina, the recent film by Alex Garland, he worked with a lot of AI researchers, neuroscientists, to understand the themes and subjects of that of AI. Not because he wanted to teach people about AI, but because he wanted to make sure he got it right. And I think that's more where we come from. I don't want anyone to think that we're trying to create a diagnostic tool or to try and I don't know. I don't want people to think that we're trying to. We're on a mission for people to understand mental illness better through this. I want people to understand Senua better and her perspective, and understand her struggles better, and base it on research. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
As a kind of follow-up to that, I was just wondering what the feedback had been from the general gaming community, whether you've had people sort of responding more to the game or more to the idea of a protagonist with mental health issues, or what has been what's come back at you from the audience at large.
We announced the game last year, and but we only kind of revealed the theme a few months ago, and the feedback so far has been overwhelmingly positive, but cautious. There's a kind of a their Ninja Theory. They've done a few games over the years, so we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt for now. But there's been also a lot outpouring of enthusiasm from players who feel like maybe their personal condition has not been represented in games, and they appreciated the fact that we were doing the research to try and at least trying to get it right. So our development on this game has been very open from the start. Every week we release information. Every month we do a video documentary. We've done a one on the mental health theme, and we're doing another one next Monday, I believe. It's very soon will be released. So we realized that we have to be open about how we're doing this and engage people with it. There's been a couple of people that have sent us angry emails. In one case, the people who have suffered from the condition. In one case, we respond to everyone directly. So in one case, I've engaged and described how we're going about this, and she's actually shared quite a lot of information now with us, and is engaged with me regularly, because it's important when you deal with a subject like this that you don't just pay lip service, you do listen and talk back. The other person was appreciative that we engaged with her, because she says that rarely happens. She still disagrees. She still thinks we shouldn't be doing this, and but that in itself is good to know, and it's good to know that you have to be sensitive to people's perspective, even if you disagree with them. Sometimes you have to take on board their fears of what you're going to do.
Okay. More questions? Oh, you do have one now.
I thought I'd make up a question after the initial tease. Why did you choose to make it an action game, and how is the action? Did you ever consider making it another type of game, or how do you tie the action into the themes?
Yeah, I mean it's kind of when we started the game, we wanted to make a game in the vein of the games we've made, so like Heavenly Sword, Enslaved, Devil May Cry, but particularly Heavenly Sword and Enslaved, Odyssey to the West, because they're very narrative-driven action games. This game has so that theme runs through into Hellblade. This game has less action, I would say. It has more experience, more. As we've been developing it, we've been finding more and more interesting experiences that we can portray, and it's actually quite compelling to play through. But in terms of action and swordplay, I'm guessing that part of the reason you're asking that question is because of violence. Perhaps, maybe. Am I reading too much? Yeah. So one of the stereotypes of conditions like mental illness and is that you have to avoid these people because they're dangerous. And it's something that's come through all, like the news, media, all kinds of media. It's quite overwhelming how pervasive that line of thought is, when there's not a clear correlation. What there is a correlation of is that a clear correlation is that people who suffer from conditions like schizophrenia are far more likely to be the victims of violence. I'm aware that this is a game about a warrior with a sword that's fighting Vikings, so that aspect of it is unavoidable, but the story is going to make clear that she was a warrior and she suffers from a mental health condition. It's not because she's mentally health. It's not because of her condition that she's a warrior. She was a warrior, and the war has escalated her condition.
Okay. Anybody else? Cool.
I'm still piecing this question together in my head, actually. But I was curious because it feels like such a deep subject, and like you said, there's so many variations of experiences. How are you deciding, like, when is the end of this experience? Like, do you think it's maybe a game you can just keep building and building on, almost like rather than just saying you're here, you'll get to here, you'll experience X things, but.
Do you mean in terms of development?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a very small budget for this game. Actually, it's a fraction of what we normally work with. It has to be finished at some point because we'll run out of money, simply put. So we're probably around halfway through production right now, and we're releasing this game digitally. So there's no onus on us to create a 20-hour experience. We can vary the price to match the length of the game that we're creating. What we want to do is to make it compelling for that amount of time that you're in the world and playing the game. Is that the gist of your question, or not really? Yeah? Okay.
Anybody else? I had a question actually based on an interview or a piece of news that I remember from, I think it was either the end of last year or the beginning of this year, and it was that you guys were sort of thinking that you might allow mods for the game at some point, or you sort of were still toying with that idea and hadn't completely thrown it out. So I was wondering sort of where you're at with that, because presumably that would bring in a whole host of potential problems with user-generated content. Or
I don't know. I mean, when we did Devil May Cry for the PC and that went out, and then the modding community started to make their own costumes and things, I think there is an implicit understanding that that people like to play with games, like in many ways, and that there's an implicit understanding that the original experience is the experience, and everything outside of that is okay. Like it's no different to people commenting on a game or interpreting or reviewing games in a different way. People can massage the game, but we'll be the curators of what the original experience is. And one of the things we did with DMC is, like, when we found interesting mods, we incorporated them back into the special edition. So we'll probably take a similar kind of approach, but try and open up the gates a little bit more. In DMC we did nothing to encourage that, and I think fans can be, when you get fans that are really buying into the fiction, they can sometimes create some amazing things.
yeah, sort of one of my big games that I spend a lot of time in is Dota, and so sort of that community is just so ridiculously creative, and it's cool to see it when it works. It's amazing. But the other thing that I was going to ask was about the indie AAA that you mentioned earlier. I was wondering whether you think that a game like this would have been harder to sort of convince people to publish if if you'd gone down that route, whether it's sort of something that has been not necessarily easy, but easier to sort of get it to this point.
I wouldn't have considered the subject if it was going through a publisher. There's no chance. Like, I mean, when you're working with a publisher, what I think from the outside, what people fail to understand is that it's a collaboration with the publisher. Often it's seen as the developer made the game and the publisher just put it out. But when you're funded by a publisher, then it's a creative collaboration. And the publisher will take into account the fact that they have to sell X number of units, X million units, and it has to appeal to everyone, and it has to have this and that and this other feature and that and that and that, and hit these buttons. And if you're dealing with something like this subject, a difficult subject like this, then it's just too dangerous to put that out there with our names on it as developers, but with an outside influence that's potentially going to steer it somewhere you don't want it to go.
Okay. Any more questions? I'm just going to double check that we haven't had anything from the outside world of people watching. Hello, people watching. I think that might be all of our questions and all of our time, unless one final. Yeah, no, go for it. Run, Kerry, run.
This is going to be the best question.
No pressure.
So as you said, this is going to be a very experiential game where you get highly immersed in everything. There's no HUD or anything like that. How are you going to deal with like those kinds of things like save game and so on and so forth without, completely breaking such an immersive experience?
That's a good question, a very good question. Do you mean things like save game menus or just save? All right. I think some things are going to be unavoidable. Like, I think there's some things that are compliance issues that you have to deal with. Even Journey had trophies, and which I think pissed off the development team somewhat. So there's going to be some aspects of that, I guess. But we're trying to remove as much of that as possible. And it's challenging. It's you'd think it'd be easier to develop a game without all that gumph on the screen, and it just makes it a lot harder. But it also, I think, makes the game feel a bit more pure in a sense. Or like, if you think of games like Ico or Shadow of the Colossus or Journey, like these games have a design simplicity to them, which is compelling. It's what makes them compelling, and I'd hope to try and recreate some of that feeling.
Cool. I think, unless this is another full start, but I think that's everybody. Everybody, yes. Okay, cool. In that case, thank you so much, Tameem, for talking to us this evening. And I think that there's going to be a little bit of extra time just outside where people can grab a drink and sort of ask questions in maybe a more informal manner, or just chat about things you've seen, or just say hi, really.
Yeah, and I'm happy to talk, and Dom's here from Ninja Theory as well, so we're happy to chat to any of you guys.
Cool. And I believe Hellblade is due out in 2016 sometime.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.